What if the last words a father ever spoke to his daughter were never meant to be heard? What if they carried a secret so heavy, so unfathomable, that no one, not friends, not family, not even the public, was meant to know? These are the questions that haunt the story of Tommy Lee Jones and his daughter, Victoria Jones. A story that is at once public and private, a tale of fame, tragedy, and unanswered questions. It's a story that seems to have been scripted by Hollywood itself, but unlike the movies, there are no rehearsed lines, no safety nets, no second takes. Only fragments, only whispers, only the haunting echo of a phone call that changed everything. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Victoria Jones was a woman caught between worlds. The child of a Hollywood legend, she grew up with the glare of fame pressing down on her shoulders. People saw the celebrity father, the accolades, the silver screen charisma, but very few knew the private struggles that simmered beneath the surface. Arrests, substance struggles, battles with mental health. The public record tells some of it, but only fragments. The rest? Hidden, obscured, or erased. And on New Year's Day, in a San Francisco hotel room, her life ended. The details surrounding her death are incomplete, contested, and in some cases, deeply disturbing. But one moment, one phone call, has become the focal point of every conversation, speculation, and headline that followed. I did what I had to do. You were never supposed to know. 14 words. That's all anyone claims to remember. 14 words that carry a universe of possibilities. A confession? A warning? A statement of protection or a hint of guilt? We may never know. But the way those words have been reported, interpreted, and debated paints a picture of a father and daughter trapped in a web of secrecy. The very idea that someone could say something so cryptic, so emotionally charged, to the person they love most in the world, is almost unbearable to contemplate. And yet, this is exactly what reportedly happened. Think about it for a moment. Imagine your last conversation with a parent or child. The laughter, the ordinary exchange of words, the mundane details. Now imagine that conversation ending with a line that doesn't comfort you. That line unsettles you. That line implies there was something you weren't supposed to know. How would that shape your memory of them, your grief, your understanding of who they were? That's the weight this alleged conversation carries, and why so many people are drawn to the mystery surrounding it. Victoria's life, like her final moments, cannot be separated from her history. She had faced multiple arrests, reports indicate, each one a window into the struggles she endured. Substance use, brushes with the law, moments of instability, these are all part of the story. But what's often overlooked is the human dimension. The pressure of growing up under the shadow of a famous parent, the weight of expectation, the loneliness of a private struggle witnessed by the public in fragments. It's a story that resonates far beyond celebrity gossip. It's a story about family, grief, secrecy, and the limits of understanding another human being, even those closest to us. And then there's Tommy Lee Jones himself, a figure known for his commanding presence on screen, a man whose characters often embody toughness, grit, and unflinching authority. It's easy to imagine him as a figure larger than life, immune to the chaos around him. But even legends have vulnerabilities. Even those who appear to have absolute control are caught in the currents of love, regret, and complicated family dynamics. For years, Jones has maintained a private stance, rarely commenting on the tragedies in his family. And that silence, combined with the cryptic nature of this last phone call, has fueled a storm of speculation. Some say the words were protective, that they shielded Victoria from something darker. Others wonder if they were ominous, a prelude to an action she could not foresee. And then there are those who claim they were a mixture of both. A father's attempt to control outcomes, to protect, to hide, to manage, in a world that offered no clear solutions. The ambiguity is what makes the story so compelling. The ambiguity is what keeps the public reading, watching, speculating. The ambiguity is what makes a single phone call, a single set of words, reverberate across headlines, timelines, and online forums. There is also the matter of timing. This call reportedly occurred just hours before Victoria's death. That proximity has led to countless theories, ranging from protective intervention to withheld knowledge, from despair to deception. Every narrative has holes, Gaps, unanswered questions. Every witness, or alleged witness, offers a different version. And in these gaps, the imagination fills the space, weaving stories that may be far more dramatic, far darker, than anything that actually occurred. Yet despite the mystery, one thing remains undeniable. There is a profound tragedy at the heart of this story. A young woman struggling with life, and a father facing the unimaginable weight of parental responsibility in circumstances beyond measure. Fame amplifies everything: the scrutiny, the commentary, the public interest, but it also isolates. It hides the intimate details, the whispered words, the private pain. And in this silence, the most haunting words can emerge, echoing long after voices have faded. So why does this story matter now? Because questions are surfacing again. Because rumors, online speculation, and renewed interest in celebrity tragedies keep these stories alive. Because the alleged final phone call is not just a curiosity. It's a focal point for a much larger discussion about family, secrecy, grief, and mental health. Every day, people ask themselves what they would do in similar circumstances. Every day, the public wonders what happens behind closed doors, away from the cameras, away from the applause. And every day, the unanswered questions linger, demanding attention. This introduction is not just a prelude, it is a doorway. A doorway into a story of fame and tragedy, secrecy and speculation, love and silence. It is a story that refuses to be simple. It is a story that challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, that the people we think we know best may have hidden depths of sorrow, that words can carry meanings beyond comprehension, and that sometimes the most devastating revelations come not in headlines, but in whispers. And what comes next will plunge deeper. We will explore the life of Victoria Jones, not just as a daughter, but as a human being navigating a complex, sometimes unforgiving world. We will examine the father behind the public persona, the man whose alleged last words have sparked endless debate. We will trace the sequence of events leading to that fateful phone call, analyzing what is known, what is claimed, and what may never be fully revealed. But before we move on, consider this. Some secrets are buried so deeply, they resist discovery. Some phone calls leave echoes that can never be silenced. And some words, once spoken, demand to be understood, even when the truth is elusive, even when the answers are out of reach. The story that follows is filled with twists, contradictions, and emotional spikes. It is a story that will test what you think you know and what you feel you know. And it all begins with that single, haunting question. What did Tommy Lee Jones say to his daughter, and why? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What do you really know about a man when you only see him on screen? When all you have are the roles he plays, the lawmen, the outlaws, the stoic heroes, the men who seem to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders. Do you know the father behind the legend? Tommy Lee Jones has spent decades appearing larger than life. He has played characters who are unflinching, intimidating, relentless, and sometimes unforgiving. The screen reflects a kind of toughness, an unshakable presence. But the question that looms over this story is far more intimate, far more complicated. What happens when that toughness is applied to one's own family? What happens behind the closed doors, away from cameras, scripts, and public adoration? In Hollywood, appearances matter. They always have. The public is trained to admire the charisma, the awards, the accolades, the image. But no amount of fame can insulate someone from personal tragedy, from human vulnerability. Tommy Lee Jones is no exception. His life, like any life, has layers, contradictions, and private struggles that the cameras never capture. The public knows him as a movie star. They know the intensity in his gaze, the gravitas in his voice, the unmistakable presence that has earned him critical acclaim and an Oscar. But fame is a double-edged sword. It brings admiration, wealth, and influence, but it also brings scrutiny, isolation, and pressure. And within that pressure lies the private, often unspoken reality of parenthood, responsibility, and the burdens of secrecy. To understand the man alleged to have spoken those cryptic words, we must first look at the life he has led. Born in 1946 in San Saba, Texas, Tommy Lee Jones grew up with a mixture of small-town simplicity and larger-than-life ambition. He was not born into fame. His trajectory was carved out through persistence, talent, and relentless drive. He attended Harvard University, studied English, and immersed himself in theater, slowly building a path toward Hollywood recognition. By the time he became a household name, Jones had cultivated a reputation for precision, intensity, and control, qualities that would define both his professional and personal life. On set, he is famously meticulous. Colleagues describe a man who knows what he wants, who can be commanding, sometimes intimidating, but always focused. These traits, which serve him well in the world of cinema, also seep into his personal life. Some family members have described him as private, reserved, and deeply disciplined. While he rarely shares intimate details with the media, those closest to him hint at a complexity that is difficult to convey publicly. Fame, after all, tends to simplify people, reduce them to archetypes, to roles we recognize on screen. But behind that screen presence is a man juggling love, expectation, and responsibility, a man navigating the very real challenges of raising a family under public scrutiny. It is within this private realm that Tommy Lee Jones' life becomes more complicated and, tragically, more human. His daughter, Victoria, was not simply a child of Hollywood. She was, in many ways, a reflection of the pressures that come with fame, expectation, and inherited privilege. A life lived in the shadow of a famous parent is never ordinary. It comes with comparisons, with whispered judgments, with a public eye constantly measuring success and failure. And while Tommy Lee Jones maintained a composed, stoic public persona, behind the scenes, he faced the same parental challenges that every parent faces, magnified by wealth, notoriety, and media attention. Many who have interacted with him privately describe a man capable of tenderness and deep loyalty, but also someone who carries a weight of responsibility like a burden too heavy to set down. Imagine balancing the public image of a Hollywood legend while trying to navigate the fragile, unpredictable world of a child struggling with mental health, substance issues, and public scrutiny. Every action, every word, is magnified. Every decision is fraught with consequence. And every silence, every refusal to speak, can be interpreted in ways he might never have intended. This duality, the public figure versus the private father, is central to understanding the story. On screen, Jones embodies authority. Off-screen, he must wrestle with human vulnerability, guilt, and the ineffable challenge of parenting in circumstances that are both intensely personal and unavoidably public. It's a difficult line to walk. It's a line that has left a trail of questions, speculation, and, tragically, heartbreak. Some have suggested that this private intensity, this need for control, may have played a role in the dynamics between father and daughter. Others argue that his silence was protective, a way of shielding Victoria from outside interference, from judgment, from the glare of public scrutiny. But the truth, as with many private family matters, is layered, elusive, and often contradictory. One aspect of Tommy Lee Jones' life that complicates the narrative further is his reputation for stoicism and reserve. While the world sees him as charismatic, direct, and confident, those who knew him personally describe someone who often internalizes emotions, who weighs his words carefully, who acts with deliberation. This carefulness, while admirable in many contexts, can be misinterpreted or tragically misunderstood by those closest to him. When words are few, their weight is enormous. And when silence is constant, it leaves gaps that imagination, speculation, and grief will inevitably fill. In this context, the alleged phone call to Victoria becomes both more understandable and more chilling. A man who is accustomed to controlling narratives on screen and in public life may struggle to control the story in his own home. A father who has navigated decades of fame and influence may find himself powerless in the face of personal tragedy. And in those moments, words, cryptic, ambiguous, and emotionally charged, can take on meanings far beyond intention. Fame also amplifies mistakes and misinterpretations. Every action is scrutinized, every statement analyzed, and every alleged word becomes a headline, a meme, a topic of debate on forums, social media, and in conversations far from the private family circle. This relentless pressure adds a layer of complexity to already fraught relationships. It also complicates attempts at understanding, making it nearly impossible to separate intention from interpretation, action from consequence, and fact from rumor. And yet, even within this web of fame, speculation, and secrecy, there is a profoundly human story. A father, a daughter, and the fragile, often painful bond between them. The story of Tommy Lee Jones is not simply a story of celebrity or legend. It is a story about human connection, about the struggles of navigating family dynamics under impossible conditions, and about the weight of love, protection, and regret. This duality, the private and the public, sets the stage for everything that follows. It explains why the alleged words spoken in that phone call carry so much power. It explains why speculation has endured. And it explains why every attempt to understand the truth is layered with uncertainty. Because the life of Tommy Lee Jones is, like that of every human being, filled with contradictions, pressures, and moments of profound complexity. So, as we move into the next chapter, we leave behind the public persona of the actor and begin to explore the daughter he sought to protect, guide, and understand. Victoria Jones' life was not just a series of public incidents. It was the private story of a young woman navigating struggle, expectation, and the sometimes impossible standards imposed by a parent whose life was always in the public eye. And it is within that tension, the intersection of fame, family, and tragedy, that the narrative begins to unfold in its most compelling and haunting form. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Victoria Jones grew up in the shadow of one of Hollywood's most recognized faces. To the world, her father, Tommy Lee Jones, was larger than life, commanding, charismatic, a figure whose presence could fill a room without even trying. But Victoria's life, unlike her father's public persona, was largely invisible. The cameras didn't follow her. The tabloids didn't dissect her every move. And yet, the pressures she faced were immense, unrelenting, and profoundly isolating. Imagine growing up with a parent whose image is on every screen, whose name appears in every headline, whose career spans decades of iconic roles. There is a certain kind of pressure that comes with that, an invisible weight that presses down on a child from the moment they realize the world is watching. Victoria's childhood, by all accounts, was a mixture of privilege and expectation, of affection and distance, of love and restraint. She had access to opportunities that few could imagine, yet she also inherited a kind of scrutiny that could never be escaped. Every choice she made, every mistake, every misstep, was magnified, not by her alone, but by the shadow of her father's fame. From early on, Victoria demonstrated intelligence, creativity, and sensitivity. Friends and acquaintances who interacted with her describe a young woman who was thoughtful, artistic, and deeply empathetic. But sensitivity, in the context of celebrity and expectation, can become a double-edged sword. The same traits that make someone deeply perceptive and compassionate can also make them vulnerable to stress, anxiety, and the corrosive effects of public scrutiny. For Victoria, the world was a complex place, where love and expectation were intertwined, and where mistakes were sometimes met with judgment rather than understanding. Her struggles began to surface in adolescence and early adulthood. Reports indicate multiple encounters with the law, substance use, and behavioral challenges. These events, when viewed individually, may appear as isolated incidents. But in the broader context of her life, they reveal a pattern of struggle, one that speaks to deeper issues, mental health, trauma, and the immense pressures of growing up in a household where fame, secrecy, and expectation were constants. Every arrest, every publicized incident, was like a flashbulb in the dark, illuminating fragments of a life that the world only partially understood. It is crucial to remember that these events do not define her entirely. Victoria was more than the incidents reported in police logs or news articles. She was a human being navigating circumstances that were extraordinarily complicated. She had dreams, hopes, and relationships. She experienced joy, love, and heartbreak. But the challenges she faced were compounded by a sense of isolation. Friends describe her as someone who often felt misunderstood, someone whose struggles were compounded by the perception that she should somehow embody perfection because of her parentage. That expectation, To meet standards that were unattainable, to live up to an image she never chose, was a weight she carried silently, privately, and sometimes painfully. Her relationships with friends and family were complicated, layered with affection, tension, and unspoken boundaries. People close to her recall moments of deep vulnerability, moments when Victoria's emotional intensity could be both compelling and overwhelming. She was a woman navigating a labyrinth of feelings, struggling to reconcile who she was with who the world expected her to be. In many ways, her life exemplifies the human experience amplified by fame. Ordinary challenges intensified, private struggles exposed, and personal failures magnified in ways that few outside the household could truly comprehend. Victoria's challenges were not limited to her relationship with the public. Her relationship with her father, Tommy Lee Jones, was equally complex. There are those who suggest that their bond was deeply loving, rooted in loyalty and protection. Others argue that it was complicated by distance, miscommunication, and the pressures inherent in being the child of a famous parent. Parents in high-profile positions often struggle to balance the public and private, the professional and the personal, the image and the reality. For Victoria, these dynamics were part of her daily life, shaping her identity, her decisions, and ultimately, the circumstances surrounding her tragic final days. Substance use became one of the most visible aspects of her struggle. While addiction and experimentation are not uncommon in young adulthood, the intersection with fame, public scrutiny, and mental health challenges creates a uniquely precarious situation. Each report of an arrest, each mention in the media, was a reminder of her vulnerability. And yet, there was an underlying story that few outside her inner circle could see. A story of a young woman trying to navigate overwhelming expectations, trying to find agency, trying to survive amidst forces largely outside her control. The pressures of living in the public eye are difficult to exaggerate. Fame, even indirect fame through family, creates an environment where privacy is almost impossible, where support networks are fragile, and where mistakes are amplified. Victoria's life illustrates this vividly. Each publicized incident, each arrest, each challenge becomes part of a narrative that the world constructs, a narrative that may or may not align with reality. This tension between perception and reality is central to understanding not only Victoria's life, but the dynamics of the alleged final phone call that has captivated so many. There were also moments of resilience and strength. Victoria was known to have periods where she appeared focused, engaged, and optimistic. She had friendships, ambitions, and moments of clarity where the weight of her circumstances seemed temporarily lighter. These moments remind us that her life cannot be reduced to headlines, reports, or rumors. She was a complex, multidimensional individual, a human being navigating extraordinary circumstances. And it is this complexity that makes the story so compelling, so tragic, and so impossible to fully resolve. As Victoria grew older, the pattern of struggle and recovery continued, intersecting with public attention in ways that were often unhelpful, sometimes harmful. The media rarely portrayed her with nuance. Headlines focused on arrest records, substance use, and sensational details rather than the underlying human story. This selective narrative further isolated her, reinforcing the sense that her private struggles were public spectacles, judged by a world that could not understand the full context. It is within this tension, between public perception and private reality, that the alleged final phone call gains its gravity. A father's words, spoken in privacy, suddenly take on monumental significance when interpreted through the lens of a daughter's history, struggles, and vulnerabilities. What might have been intended as guidance, warning, or even reassurance becomes, in the public imagination, a cryptic message laden with speculation. And because the world only sees fragments, the arrests, the headlines, the dramatic details, the weight of interpretation falls to us, the observers, the audience. So as we examine Victoria's life, we see a woman defined not by fame, but by struggle, not by privilege, but by vulnerability. Not by headlines, but by the intimate, complicated reality of her human experience. She was someone navigating a world where love and pressure coexisted, where safety and danger were inseparable, and where the very people she relied on most, family, in particular her father, operated in a realm of secrecy and silence. And it is this secrecy, this tension between visibility and privacy, that sets the stage for the tragedy that unfolded. Victoria Jones' story is a reminder that fame does not protect, it magnifies. That public scrutiny does not alleviate pain, it intensifies it. That parental love, when constrained by silence, can become ambiguous, open to misinterpretation, and, tragically, misunderstood. Her life, marked by struggle and brief moments of triumph, was a series of highs and lows that few outside her immediate circle could truly comprehend. And the final hours, the phone call, the words spoken, the ambiguity that remains, cannot be understood without this context. To understand Victoria is to recognize the extraordinary complexity of her existence, the pressures she faced, and the ways in which fame, family, and vulnerability collided in ways both intimate and public. But what came next would shift the story from a life defined by struggle into a moment defined by mystery, and no one saw it coming. What does it mean when someone's life becomes a series of public incidents? When every misstep, every struggle, every desperate moment is documented, analyzed, and reduced to a headline. For Victoria Jones, the story of her arrests and public challenges is more than a list of dates and charges. It's a window into a young woman navigating circumstances she could not control and a society eager to judge from the sidelines. The first brush with law enforcement, as reported, was not the end of her troubles. It was the beginning of a pattern that would, over the years, define her public image in ways she could not escape. Arrests, probation, charges, brief stints in court, interactions with officers, and the surrounding media coverage created a framework through which the world came to perceive her. And yet, behind each headline, each mugshot, there was a human story. A person struggling with inner turmoil, mental health challenges, and the complex pressures of growing up in a household defined by fame and expectation. It's important to understand the context. Victoria was not merely acting out for attention, nor was she living a reckless lifestyle out of sheer defiance. Reports suggest that her encounters with law enforcement were often tied to substance use, moments of crisis, and behavioral patterns rooted in mental health struggles. These struggles, while publicized, were often misunderstood or oversimplified. The media thrives on clarity, on digestible narratives, on drama. But life is rarely that simple. Life, in Victoria's case, was messy, painful, and complicated, layered with nuance that no headline could ever capture. Each arrest carried consequences beyond the immediate legal implications. They became part of a public narrative, one that framed her as troubled, unstable, or even dangerous. Friends and acquaintances often spoke of her struggles with compassion, but the public eye is rarely so forgiving. In a world obsessed with celebrity, it is easy to forget that behind every report is a human being grappling with pain, fear, and the desire to survive. Consider, for a moment, the psychological toll of repeated public scrutiny. Every incident reinforced a perception she may have already internalized, that she was being watched, judged, and evaluated at all times. The weight of observation can exacerbate mental health challenges, fuel anxiety, and create a feedback loop that is difficult to break. Victoria's reported arrests, while isolated events on paper, were in reality part of an ongoing spiral, one that entwined personal struggle with public perception in ways that were impossible to escape. The pattern was clear: a struggle with substances, repeated encounters with law enforcement, and the accompanying public scrutiny. But what drove this spiral? Some suggest it was a rebellion against expectation, a desperate attempt to carve out autonomy in a life defined by parental fame. Others point to deeper psychological wounds, experiences of trauma, and the compounded stress of navigating personal challenges under an unforgiving gaze. In truth, it was likely all of these things, interwoven, complex, and tragically human. One of the most striking aspects of Victoria's story is the way these arrests were reported in isolation. The public saw the headlines, the dates, the charges. But the context, the emotional, familial, and psychological landscape, was largely invisible. This absence of context invites speculation. It invites judgment, and it sets the stage for the larger narrative surrounding her final days. Because if her life had been understood in its full complexity, the alleged final phone call with her father might be seen differently. Less as a cryptic warning, and more as part of a family navigating unprecedented pressures. The media attention surrounding each incident also compounded the personal struggle. Headlines are blunt instruments. They highlight drama, emphasize failure, and create a narrative that is difficult to escape. For Victoria, this meant that every misstep was amplified, every struggle was magnified, and every moment of vulnerability became a spectacle. And when you are young, sensitive, and already struggling with mental health challenges, the weight of that scrutiny is crushing. There is also the question of accountability versus compassion. Legal systems, social structures, and media coverage often focus on punishment and public perception rather than understanding, support, or intervention. Victoria's repeated encounters with law enforcement illustrate a tension between justice and care, between public judgment and private needs. Friends and acquaintances described efforts to support her, to intervene, to provide guidance. But those efforts were often overshadowed by the public narrative, by the court of public opinion, and by the relentless attention to each arrest. The spiral, once begun, can be difficult to stop. Each incident feeds into the next, creating a sense of inevitability. Every arrest, every public report, became a step along a path she may have felt powerless to alter. And the sense of isolation intensified. When the world sees only mistakes, rather than the person behind them, it is easy to internalize a narrative of failure, of being trapped, of being irreparably misunderstood. This spiral was not simply a series of discrete events. It was the backdrop against which Victoria's final days unfolded. Every arrest, every legal challenge, every headline contributed to a cumulative pressure that shaped her mental state, her relationships, and her interactions with those closest to her, including her father. The alleged final phone call must be viewed within this context. A young woman weighed down by a lifetime of scrutiny, struggle, and expectation, and a father grappling with the impossibility of protecting her fully while navigating his own public and private responsibilities. But there is another layer to consider: the contradictions, gaps, and inconsistencies in the reporting itself. Arrests are documented, but the details often conflict between sources. Charges are recorded, but outcomes vary. Friends offer differing accounts of circumstances. Media reports sometimes omit context, exaggerate details, or rely on anonymous sources. This creates a murky, contested narrative, one that leaves room for speculation, interpretation, and doubt. And in a story as emotionally charged as this, doubt can feel like truth. So as we reflect on Victoria's public spiral, it's crucial to remember the human dimension. These are not just incidents. They are markers of struggle, evidence of vulnerability, and glimpses into the challenges of living a life under scrutiny. They are pieces of a puzzle that, when taken together, paint a picture of a young woman navigating forces far larger than herself, and a family grappling with the consequences in private. The final piece of this chapter is the inevitable question: how does a life filled with struggle, public attention, and legal complications intersect with a private family crisis? How do repeated public incidents shape the dynamics of parent and child, especially when the parent is a figure of immense public authority and private intensity? The answer is not simple, and it is not clear, but it sets the stage for the next chapter, where we examine the circumstances surrounding Victoria's final days, the San Francisco hotel, and the moments leading up to that alleged phone call that has captured so much attention. And what happened in those final hours? The moments after the spiral reached its peak would transform speculation into a tragedy that no one could ignore. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The San Francisco skyline glimmers with lights, the city alive with celebration, with laughter, with the ordinary chaos of life continuing its rhythm. But in one hotel room on New Year's Day, the ordinary turned tragic. Victoria Jones, a young woman whose life had been defined by struggle, expectation, and public scrutiny, was found dead. The place where people check in for comfort, anonymity, or celebration became the site of the ultimate finality. A place where secrets converged, where unanswered questions loomed larger than the city lights outside, and where a family's grief would begin in its most incomprehensible form. A hotel is supposed to be neutral territory, a temporary shelter from the world. It's a liminal space, familiar enough to be comforting, unfamiliar enough to remain anonymous. Guests come and go, lives intersect briefly, and most details disappear into the ether. But for Victoria, the hotel became the stage for the culmination of years of private struggle colliding with public consequence. In those final hours, the backdrop was mundane, the scene ordinary: check-in, hallways, doors, elevators. And yet, within that ordinariness, extraordinary tragedy occurred. A private calamity in a public space. The timeline of New Year's Day is reconstructed from reports, witness accounts, and official documents. But even here, gaps appear. Hours of her day remain unaccounted for. Moments that could have been intervention points were missed. Actions that might have changed the trajectory remain unknown. Every detail, no matter how small, becomes magnified because the outcome was irreversible. And the proximity to her alleged final phone call with her father adds a layer of haunting inevitability. The ordinary setting of a hotel room, the private communication, and the ultimate tragedy intertwined in a way that would leave lasting questions. Those who attempt to piece together the sequence often confront contradictions. Security logs may reflect movements, but the context is unclear. Witnesses may remember seeing her, but their recollections vary. And in a hotel, where transient populations are the norm, facts blur, and certainty is elusive. This ambiguity mirrors the larger story of Victoria's life. Fragments, partially understood, filtered through the lens of speculation and media interpretation. Every reconstruction carries the possibility of error, and every narrative constructed from these fragments is haunted by what may never be fully known. Victoria's final hours were marked by a sense of tension, according to those close to her. Small decisions, the choice of hotel, the timing of arrival, the interactions with staff, take on larger significance in hindsight. Every detail becomes a potential clue, a potential window into the state of her mind, the nature of her struggles, and the private dynamics of her family. And central to this is the alleged phone call, the words purportedly spoken by her father that have captivated so much attention. The hotel room, a site of temporary refuge, also became the conduit for a message that would ripple through time, interpretation, and speculation. Hotels are inherently liminal spaces, but they also serve as mirrors of human vulnerability. People bring their lives in microcosm into these rooms, their worries, their fears, their secrets. And in Victoria's case, the room itself bore witness to a convergence of these pressures. Personal struggle, family tension, mental health challenges, and the weight of public scrutiny. Even small environmental factors, the isolation of a locked door, the sterile neutrality of furnishings, the muted city noise outside, amplify the sense of detachment, of solitude, of quiet tension before tragedy. The city around her, unaware, continued its New Year's Day celebrations. Streets buzzed with life. Hotels hosted travelers with ordinary concerns. And yet, behind one door, the confluence of private struggle and unresolved questions created a moment that would not be forgotten. The setting underscores a central paradox. Tragedy often occurs in ordinary spaces, in moments that seem unremarkable until the consequences become irrevocable. The San Francisco Hotel, in this sense, was both ordinary and extraordinary, a backdrop to a deeply private calamity within the context of a bustling, oblivious city. Security footage, reports from staff, and law enforcement accounts form pieces of a puzzle that remains incomplete. There are gaps, hours where Victoria's actions remain unknown, interactions that cannot be verified, movements that are unrecorded. Each gap feeds speculation. Each unknown fuels questions that have no clear answers. And within these gaps lies the tension that makes this story so compelling. The tension between what was seen, what was reported, and what was never known. The alleged final phone call with Tommy Lee Jones occurred within this framework of uncertainty. The ordinary hotel room becomes the setting for an extraordinary, emotionally charged moment. The words reportedly spoken, cryptic, ambiguous, and haunting, carry weight not just because of their content, but because of the setting in which they occurred. It is an intimate, private communication in a transient, public-adjacent space. The contrast heightens the drama. The intersection of ordinary life, familial secrecy, and profound tragedy. It is also critical to recognize the human experience of isolation within these spaces. Victoria's life, marked by repeated public scrutiny and private struggle, converged with the physical isolation of the hotel room. Even within a bustling building, a person can be utterly alone in their thoughts, fears, and decisions. This sense of isolation intensifies vulnerability. It also amplifies the impact of communication. The phone call becomes a lifeline, a source of connection, and simultaneously a source of tension, depending on its content and context. Observers and commentators often speculate about why Victoria was in the hotel at that time, what she was doing, and who she interacted with. Reports suggest she may have been seeking temporary refuge, trying to manage stress, or attempting to avoid further public attention. The reasons are likely complex, layered, and personal. And yet, the fact that she was in a neutral, public-adjacent space underscores a broader theme. The juxtaposition of visibility and invisibility, the tension between public perception and private reality, and the ways in which ordinary locations can become the stage for extraordinary tragedy. This chapter also underscores a critical truth: the setting matters. A hotel room is a confined space, a place with defined boundaries, but within it, events can unfold in ways that are uncontrollable and irreversible. The ordinary furniture, the neutral walls, the silent corridors, all contribute to a sense of stillness and inevitability. And in Victoria's case, these elements formed the backdrop for the moments leading up to her alleged final phone call, a call that would resonate far beyond the walls of that room. The San Francisco Hotel, in other words, is not just a location. It is a character in this story. It embodies anonymity, isolation, and neutrality, yet it also becomes a vessel for human drama, human vulnerability, and human tragedy. It is a place where decisions were made, where emotions were confronted, and where secrets, some revealed, some hidden, intersected in a way that would have lasting consequences. And as we leave this chapter, the question remains: what transpired in those final hours? How did a private space in a public building become the setting for a moment that would dominate headlines, speculation, and public imagination? And what did the alleged words spoken by her father mean within that context? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Imagine the weight of a phone in your hand. Imagine knowing that the person on the other end is someone you love above all else. Imagine that the last conversation you will ever have with them is happening right now, and you have no idea it is the final one. This is the haunting reality at the center of the story of Tommy Lee Jones and his daughter, Victoria. The call itself is shrouded in ambiguity, filtered through second-hand accounts, media speculation, and the fractured memories of those close to the situation. Yet, for all its uncertainty, the alleged words exchanged during that conversation have captured the imagination of countless observers, raising questions that may never be fully answered. The call reportedly occurred on New Year's Day, just hours before Victoria's life ended. According to sources, it was not an ordinary conversation. There was a tension in her voice, a fragility, an urgency. And there was the voice of a father, calm yet commanding, measured yet carrying the weight of decades of experience, fame, and private responsibility. The alleged words: "I did what I had to do. You were never supposed to know." 14 words. Cryptic, ambiguous, heavy with possible meaning. But what do they truly signify? Were they a confession? A warning? A message of protection? Or something else entirely? What makes this call so compelling is the contrast between ordinary communication and extraordinary consequence. Most phone calls are mundane: scheduling plans, checking in, casual conversation. But this call, according to reports, was charged with emotion, layered with subtext, and potentially carrying information that no one outside the family was meant to hear. It is precisely this tension, the ordinary transformed into extraordinary by context, that grips our attention and fuels the speculation that surrounds the story. To understand the significance of these alleged words, we must consider the dynamics between father and daughter. Tommy Lee Jones is known for his stoicism, his precision, his private nature. Victoria, by all accounts, was deeply sensitive, struggling with substance use, mental health challenges, and the pressures of life in the shadow of a famous parent. A conversation between these two is inevitably layered. Care mixed with control, affection mixed with discipline, protection mixed with limitation. And in that mixture, a single sentence can carry profound weight, open to interpretation far beyond its literal meaning. Some have argued that the phrase, "I did what I had to do," could reflect a protective instinct. Perhaps it was a reference to difficult decisions made in private, steps taken to shield Victoria from danger, or actions intended to help her navigate a world that had proven unforgiving. Others suggest a darker interpretation, a prelude, a confession, a burden too heavy to explain. The ambiguity is deliberate, whether intentional or the natural result of human complexity. And it is this ambiguity that sustains the fascination, the speculation, and the unease surrounding the call. Consider the psychology of final conversations. When someone senses a relationship or a life reaching a point of no return, the words chosen, the tone employed, and the pauses observed take on extraordinary significance. Each syllable can be dissected, analyzed, and interpreted in infinite ways. For Victoria and her father, whose relationship was defined by both love and tension, each word carried multiple layers of potential meaning. And in hindsight, with the outcome tragically fixed, these words become emblematic, symbols of questions that may never be answered. The alleged call also highlights the broader pressures that had defined Victoria's life. Repeated arrests, public scrutiny, substance struggles. All these factors created a context in which communication between parent and child was fraught. Every word spoken had the potential to reassure or unsettle, to calm or to alarm. And within that context, the alleged final sentence takes on a weight that is almost unbearable to contemplate. A phrase intended, or interpreted, as a revelation, a warning, a shield, or a burden, delivered in private, yet now scrutinized by the world. It is also important to note the human desire to find clarity, certainty, and meaning where it may not exist. The public has seized on this phone call as a focal point for understanding, for judgment, and for narrative closure. And yet, the reality is that the conversation likely carried shades of emotion, nuance, and intention that can never be fully reconstructed. Memory is unreliable, reports are filtered through perception, and interpretation is shaped by context and desire. The result is a story that is both tantalizingly precise and frustratingly elusive, a narrative suspended in ambiguity. Direct accounts of the call remain scarce. Those who claim knowledge often provide only fragments, leaving the rest to inference. This fragmentary nature adds to the suspense, forcing observers to fill in gaps with their own assumptions, fears, and interpretations. The very act of withholding complete information, whether intentional or inevitable, ensures that the story remains alive, provocative, and endlessly compelling. In addition, the alleged call has become a lens through which broader questions are examined. The intersection of fame and privacy, the role of secrecy in family dynamics, the complexities of parental responsibility, and the consequences of public scrutiny on private relationships. It is not simply a single moment frozen in time. It is a catalyst for reflection, debate, and, for many, unease. The ambiguity ensures that the story transcends celebrity gossip, entering a space where human psychology, familial complexity, and moral questioning converge. There is also a dramatic irony to consider. The words, reported to be uttered in the intimacy of a private conversation, have now become public knowledge. What was intended for a single individual, a daughter, has been dissected, analyzed, and speculated upon by countless observers who were never present. The privacy of the moment collides with the public's appetite for understanding, creating a tension that mirrors the very dynamics at play in the father-daughter relationship itself. Finally, the alleged call sets the stage for the tragic aftermath. Whether intended to reassure, warn, or confess, the words were followed by a sequence of events that culminated in the most profound loss imaginable. And it is precisely the combination of ambiguity, timing, and emotional weight that transforms a single conversation into a cultural and human focal point. a moment frozen in speculation, haunting interpretation, and enduring curiosity. And so, we are left with the question that drives this chapter, this story, and much of the fascination surrounding it. What did those words truly mean? Were they protective, ominous, cryptic, or a mixture of all three? And perhaps most hauntingly, did Victoria understand their full meaning at the time, or were they another layer of mystery, left to echo unanswered in the final hours of her life? But what came next would push the story from ambiguity to tragedy, and no one saw it coming. 14 words. That is all it took to ignite a storm of speculation, analysis, and heartbreak. I did what I had to do. You were never supposed to know. It is a sentence that is at once simple and confounding, a cryptic utterance that has been dissected in endless forums, whispered in private conversations, and replayed in the imaginations of those trying to understand its meaning. How can a single line carry so much weight? How can it simultaneously suggest protection, guilt, secrecy, and love? And most importantly, what did Tommy Lee Jones mean when he spoke it? Or what do we think he meant? Language is a strange and delicate tool, especially when wielded in moments of extreme emotional intensity. Every word carries layers of connotation, every pause creates suspense, and every syllable can be filtered through the lens of perception, experience, and desire. In the case of Victoria and her father, those 14 words are loaded with potential interpretations. They could signify action taken to protect her, a confession about choices made in private, or an acknowledgement of a secret that could no longer remain hidden. The ambiguity ensures that the meaning is never fixed, and that uncertainty is part of the enduring fascination with this story. Some analysts suggest that "I did what I had to do" reflects the difficult choices a parent may make when confronting challenges that are largely invisible to the public. Perhaps Tommy Lee Jones had intervened in ways that could not be understood by his daughter, by law enforcement, or by the media. Perhaps there were decisions made regarding her mental health, her safety, or her struggles with substances that required discretion and secrecy. In this interpretation, the phrase is protective, heavy with paternal care, and yet almost unbearably opaque. Others read the words as a potential prelude to action that had darker implications. Could the phrase imply regret, responsibility, or guilt? Could it be a subtle acknowledgement of something irreversible? The phrasing is remarkably neutral in tone, yet emotionally charged in context, allowing for a wide range of possible interpretations. It is a sentence that is at once declarative and confounding, precise in grammar, yet ambiguous in intent. And this duality is what has made it such a magnet for speculation. Then there is the second clause. You were never supposed to know. This phrase heightens the tension exponentially. It implies secrecy, deliberate concealment, and a boundary that had been crossed, intentionally or inadvertently. For a daughter already struggling with personal demons, hearing that some truth had been withheld could be both shocking and destabilizing. For observers, it is a gateway into a labyrinth of possibilities. What was she not supposed to know? Why? And what are the consequences of that concealment? The cryptic nature of the phrase also highlights the complexity of parent-child relationships, particularly in situations where fame, pressure, and personal struggle intersect. Parents often make decisions they believe are for the good of their children, yet those decisions can be incomprehensible, opaque, or even painful from the child's perspective. And in families under public scrutiny, the margin for error, or for private discretion, is even smaller. The secrecy implied in this phrase underscores a tension that is universal yet intensified, the desire to protect and the difficulty of communicating truth. Psychologists who study communication and high-stakes family dynamics note that ambiguity in language often serves multiple functions. It can shield the speaker from immediate confrontation, allow for flexibility in interpretation, and serve as a buffer against guilt or responsibility. In extreme situations, cryptic phrasing can even be a coping mechanism, a way of managing a situation that feels unmanageable. In this context, the alleged words of Tommy Lee Jones may have served not only as a message to Victoria, but as a tool for the speaker himself to navigate a profoundly difficult emotional landscape. Public fascination with the line is also driven by the human desire to decode mystery, to assign narrative, and to seek closure where none exists. We are drawn to ambiguity precisely because it challenges our understanding, because it invites us to speculate, and because it forces us to confront uncomfortable possibilities. What we know, or think we know, about these 14 words is filtered through emotion, rumor, and interpretation. And the resulting narratives are as diverse as they are compelling. Some suggest a purely protective reading. I did what I had to do might reflect efforts to prevent her from harm. Interventions in her life, discreet actions to stabilize her situation, or decisions made in the hope of shielding her from danger. The second part, you were never supposed to know, could be interpreted as an acknowledgement that some parental actions are best hidden from the child, intended to prevent further stress or anxiety. In this reading, the phrase is tragic yet loving, an invisible act of care, ultimately misunderstood in retrospect. Others, however, interpret the phrase as ominous. Could the words hint at knowledge withheld about substances, medical interventions, or legal matters? Could it be an acknowledgement of an action that cannot be reversed, something that Victoria herself might have been powerless to prevent? This darker reading is fueled by the timing of the call, the public attention to her struggles, and the stark tragedy that followed. And while there is no definitive evidence to confirm this interpretation, the very possibility ensures that the phrase remains haunting, mysterious, and impossible to resolve. Then there is the broader cultural context. The line resonates beyond this specific family tragedy because it taps into universal themes: the complexity of love, the limits of parental understanding, the opacity of human intention, and the consequences of secrecy. Most families never face the pressures of public scrutiny, but every family struggles with communication, hidden truths, and the burden of decisions made behind closed doors. In this sense, the phrase is emblematic, both intensely personal and universally resonant. The enduring fascination with these words also reflects a societal obsession with closure, explanation, and narrative. We crave a clear story where cause and effect are apparent. We seek a moral or emotional resolution that can make sense of tragedy. But life, and particularly a life lived under extraordinary pressures, is rarely so tidy. The ambiguity of "I did what I had to do, you were never supposed to know" reminds us of the limits of understanding, the fragility of communication, and the weight of unspoken decisions. And finally, this cryptic phrase sets the stage for the next stage of the story, the aftermath. How did these words reverberate through Victoria's final hours? How did they shape the perception of her death, the public narrative, and the ongoing speculation? The ambiguity ensures that every subsequent event is charged with additional meaning, that every moment is refracted through the prism of what was said, what was withheld, and what can never be fully understood. As we consider these 14 words, the questions multiply. What did he mean? What did she understand? And what role did this communication play in the sequence of events that followed? The ambiguity is profound, the implications staggering, and the human dimension unavoidable. But what came next would turn cryptic ambiguity into irreversible consequence, and no one saw it coming. When tragedy strikes a family in the glare of the public eye, the ordinary process of grief becomes extraordinary. For Tommy Lee Jones, the death of his daughter Victoria was not only a deeply personal loss. It was a loss that immediately became public property. Within hours of the incident at the San Francisco hotel, social media erupted. Headlines blared, rumors spread, and the world demanded answers to questions that were impossible to answer fully. But the first moments after Victoria's death were private, chaotic, and heart-wrenching, a reality far removed from the scrutiny that followed. For family, the aftermath is a storm of conflicting emotions: grief, guilt, confusion, and anger. Loved ones are forced to navigate both their private sorrow and the intrusive gaze of the world. Friends describe Tommy Lee Jones as a man visibly shaken, burdened not only by the shock of his daughter's death, but also by the weight of speculation, judgment, and expectation. The father who had maintained a stoic, controlled public persona was suddenly confronted with vulnerability of the most extreme kind. And in that vulnerability, even the simplest decisions, how to communicate with authorities, how to respond to the media, how to manage private mourning, became fraught with complexity. Media coverage surged immediately. Reports, some verified and some speculative, chronicled the incident with a mix of urgency and sensationalism. Every detail was parsed: the hotel, the timing, the alleged phone call, and Victoria's history of arrests and substance use. Some outlets portrayed her life through a lens of tragedy and cautionary tale. Others emphasized scandal, feeding the public's appetite for drama. The relentless focus on her struggles, rather than the human dimensions of her experience, exemplifies the challenge of public mourning for those in the shadow of fame. Social media amplified every narrative, often without regard for accuracy or context. Rumors became facts for many, speculation was taken as certainty, and commentary frequently overlooked the human cost. Messages of sympathy and condolence were mixed with criticism and judgment, creating a distorted mirror of the public's perception of grief. Tommy Lee Jones, like many public figures, found himself navigating this treacherous landscape while attempting to process an unfathomable personal loss. Every statement, every silence, every public appearance was scrutinized, dissected, and interpreted. Family dynamics, already complicated, were further strained. Reports suggest that relatives grappled with conflicting emotions: loyalty, grief, protective instincts, and private questions about what had led to this outcome. In families of public figures, even mourning becomes performative at times, or at least subject to external pressures. What should be private, the intimate exchange of grief, the raw moments of sorrow, is forced into a public arena, creating tension, misinterpretation, and additional stress. One of the most haunting aspects of the aftermath is the way the alleged phone call became a focal point. The 14 words Tommy Lee Jones reportedly spoke were replayed endlessly in media coverage, in online forums, and in social conversation. Analysts debated their meaning, friends questioned their intent, and the public speculated about secrets, guilt, and responsibility. In many ways, the call became a symbol of everything the world could not know. The private struggles, the human complexity, and the ambiguity of parental love in extraordinary circumstances. This scrutiny also amplified the sense of isolation that often follows tragedy. Tommy Lee Jones, despite his fame, found himself navigating profound grief in a context that offered no sanctuary. Every interaction, even with those seeking to offer support, was mediated by attention, judgment, and interpretation. Every choice about how to respond publicly, whether to speak, to release a statement, or to remain silent, was fraught with consequence. And yet, within this storm, the core of the tragedy remained: a father and daughter separated forever, a life lost, and questions that would never be fully answered.